So for World Interaction Design Day, which is today, there's going to be, it's sponsored by Adobe and it's sponsored by IxDA globally, and it's 80 cities worldwide that are going to be sharing the day with each other. And we were lucky enough to get these amazing panelists to come along and share it with us today. So I'd like to introduce the panel to you. As you can see from the slide, you can tweet any questions that you have to IxDA Sydney. I don't actually have that with me at the moment, and I believe there were a few questions that came in this afternoon. We have some questions to start us off, so we will start with those, and then if we don't get to your question, we will come to the audience to ask questions at the end. So throw your hand in the air if we don't get to yours. It's on Twitter. And if you want to use the hashtag IxDD 2018, that's the Interaction Design Day hashtags as well. So to introduce you to the panel, Dr. Manisha Amin is our first panellist. She's the CEO of the Centre for Inclusive Design. That's formerly Media Access Australia. It's a not-for-profit social enterprise that uses the power of the marketplace. As the real and digital worlds collide, the Centre helps people to build and design products, services and policies that are inclusive and usable to as many people as possible. As technology becomes more complex, they work to provide simple solutions to so that everyone has opportunity to participate in economic, social, civil, political and cultural life. Ashlea joins us from Canberra. We are very pleased to have her here. She's a freelance UX researcher, writer and keynote speaker with more than 8 years of experience in UX, spanning both the public and private sectors in Australia, as well as the international startup space. She comes from an industrial design background and co-founded UX advice column UX Agony Aunt with Optimal Workshop in 2015. Ashlea is a proud autistic person who was diagnosed later in life at the age of 29 and is currently writing her first book on life as an autistic UXer that will also explore research and design for autism. And there is a link to Ashlea's website on our website that you can take a closer look at that. Mira has over 14 years experience working with digital agencies and consultancies and is the former head of accessibility and user experience at AbilityNet, where she helped deliver the most inclusive Olympic Games in London in 2012. At the DTA, Mira was a product manager and service designer on the Identity Program, GovPass, and is currently heading up the service design practice at the DTA. She has worked for global organisations including British Telecom, HSBC, Microsoft, the United Nations and Walmart. It's quite a haul. Sarah joins us from Intopia, where she's the Director of Accessibility Services and co-founder. It's Australia's fastest growing digital accessibility consultancy dedicated to creating an inclusive digital world. Sarah has worked in digital accessibility and inclusion for over 8 years, including as Head of Accessibility Services with PwC Australia, and Digital Accessibility Evangelist and Specialist for Media Access Australia. Sarah is founder of AliBytes, a series of events run across the Australian Global Accessibility Awareness Day, and AliCam, Australia's premier conference on digital accessibility and inclusion. She's also co-organiser of the Sydney Web Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. So we have quite the panel here tonight. To get us started, we have some questions, which I will just pull up. So I'm going to take a seat. We have a second microphone there. Excellent. So what about the particular aspect of diversity and inclusion attracted you to that area of design, personally or professionally?
I think I'm first off with the microphone. So I actually still remember my aha moment, and it was sitting in a conference around digital accessibility, so specifically designing for people with disability. And this was 12, 15 years ago. And someone brought up a real estate site, sort of like your realestate.com now. And it had a map of Australia, and you had to click on one of the states in order to progress past to then search for a particular property in that state. And someone demonstrated it with a screen reader, so technology that reads sort of information on the screen out aloud for people that are blind. And it was completely inaccessible. It was an absolute showstopper. You could not get past, and therefore you could not use the site. And I still remember sitting in the audience going, oh, I get it. And it wasn't until a number of years later that I actually made it into my career, but it was my defining moment of, we really need to do better. And I think everything really led from that.
Thanks, Sarah. I had an aha moment as well. So my career actually started as a visual designer and a front-end developer. And I was working on this website. So it was actually Times Spelling Bee online. And if you know what that is, the colors were yellow, white. You can see where I'm going with this. And there I was doing some of the visual design, and I'm coding it as well. But it wasn't until I actually was showing my dad and explaining to my dad what I do that he actually struggled to look at the typical white on yellow background, like the color contrast. And that's when the penny dropped for me, I think, that personal and professional point of view. And I remember going back to work and saying, surely there's something out there. And then I discovered the WCAG guidelines, and my life just spiraled into the world of accessibility and inclusivity. But it was a great spiral for me. Really, really interesting experience seeing my dad really struggle with the website that I had designed and I had coded as well. And I remember going back to work and speaking to my manager at the time, and he said to me, "You what now?" And I said, "Well, since it's a highly sort of transactional public website, we might need to make this accessible, and here's all the research I've done." And that was back in 2007.
So obviously it's super personal for me because it relates to what sits between my ears. Finding out at the age of 29 and a half that that there's nothing wrong with me, that I'm not some kind of monster or something, that I just have a different brain, was a really big turning point for me, because I spent nearly 30 years of my life thinking that there was something off about me and that it wasn't okay for me to be different. And then getting that diagnosis was a massive turning point for me, because it was like, okay, so I've got a different brain. What does that mean? And also, what can I do to help other people with different brains like mine? Oh, you've got your own mic.
But it helps if I turn it on, right? Is that better? So I've always been really interested in social justice, and I've always worked in social justice in some shape or form. So I actually thought that this accessibility stuff was normal. Like, when I worked in marketing, of course you'd build a site that was accessible. Of course you'd do products that were accessible. But it was when I came to Media Access Australia at the time, I realised that actually it's not that easy, and not everyone thinks this way. And one of, I think, the light bulb moments for me was I was looking at some research. This is not about disability, but it's about the end of average and the way we all design. And have any of you heard the seatbelt story? Yes, no? A couple of you? Yeah. So in the 1960s, when we think about average, and we talk about people designing for people who are average, right? And for people like themselves. In the 1960s, with seatbelts, you used to have 2 crash test dummies. One dummy was at the 95th percentile for men. So as tall as only 5% of men who were taller than this crash test dummy. And the other dummy was at the 5th percentile for women. So really short, probably like me, or maybe Purvi, actually. It's even shorter than I am. But, really short. And they used to use these crash test dummies. And the companies said, look, this is just not cost effective for us. So they went to a dummy that was a 50th percentile male. Okay. 47% of women have more serious injuries in car crashes than men. Let's just stop there for a sec. They changed this in 2011. Okay. So for me, we talk about online, we talk about tech a lot, but if we're taking this same mindset that we've always had into the tech world, what are we creating? And what's the opportunity to make it something different?
Which leads very nicely into the next question, which is around what sort of practical tips you have to bring that kind of mindset into your design operations because it's all very well when we talk a lot about how we can have accessibility and usability, and then when the rubber hits the road, we're frequently confronted with it's not cost effective or don't do research or all those sort of things. So what are your top tips to actually get that kind of behaviour embedded in organisations in design operations?
Looks like I'm going first this time. I actually recently being over the last couple of years, started to venture into product management world, and it's been really good for me, you know, being someone who is a service design practitioner, design research practitioner in general. Product management actually gave me the flexibility and more sort of responsibility, accountability, and some authority over the product that I was designing or my team was building and developing. One of the first things, I mean, coming from a strong sort of, you know, long time spent in accessibility and inclusion background, one thing that was really important for me was to make accessibility and inclusion as part of my definition of done. So one of the primary things that I looked at doing in my team at DTA was splitting up the WCAG guidelines between different roles. And of course the team hated me when I did that. You know, developers were looking at me like, we've got automated tests for this kind of thing. And I said, no, I want you to take this seriously. This is really important to me, and it's important to the other designers and researchers in the team. So we split the roles up. So whatever was content designer specific, it was their responsibility to check that before it went into done, or before it went into review even. And there was another line that had my head on there, that basically said Mira has to check this before it goes into done, even if someone else is reviewing it, so that's great. But everyone in the team had some form of accountability towards accessibility, and that included testing with people with impairments as well on a sprintly basis too. And you know, for me, that was really important. So when I came on board as a product manager, I set the tone very earlier on and said, this is how we're going to do it, and worked with our accessibility lead at the time to put together a strategy for the product that I was working on. We then managed to roll that same strategy in a slightly sort of, you know, it evolved ever so slightly for some of the different teams, but they were able to take that as a template and roll that out across some of the other teams across the DTA as well. But it just meant that everyone had a stake in there, and it wasn't something that, you know, it was something that you were baking in right from the beginning rather than, you know, right at the end, we're going to do some automated tests. So I learned that as I wanted to do that, and it was really important to me. And being a product manager was the first time that I actually felt that I could make that happen as well. So I would say if you have the opportunity to do so, make it part of your whole development design lifecycle. So we had designers looking at specific things when it came to color contrast, for example, and then the developers doing the automated tests, because you should, but then go off and do some, you know, actual manual testing as well. And if you can't do it on a sprintly basis, do it on a monthly basis or something, depending on how long your product or your service cycle is going on for. But also test with people, you know, make that part of your cadence and build that in, and, you know, make time for it. If you plan for it, it doesn't seem like a chore when it comes around to it.
So for me, I think it's starting off challenging our perceptions and recognising that everyone is different, that everyone has different needs and preferences. The situations that we are put in means that we might need to interact with things in a different way. And instead of, you know, we often, the statistic is always trotted out, because unfortunately accessibility and inclusion often is still synonymous with disability. And people sort of trot out the, you know, nearly 20%, 1 in 5 Australians have some form of disability as recognised in the census. And I always, you know, start to talk to people, and my poor mum, I use her as the example, and I say, well, look, she had cataracts. They weren't operated on for a few years. Her hearing is sort of getting worse as she's getting older, and she does not tick that box on the census. It's just part of getting older. So if you want to play the numbers game, and to be honest, I'm not a fan of the numbers game. I'm a fan of, you know, we want to design inclusive, wonderful experiences for everyone. But instead of thinking about it of return on investment and cost effectiveness and that kind of thing, if you want to look at that, start looking at, okay, yes, we have our disability specific, and then we have an ageing population, and that's going to increase with age. And then we have approximately 10% of the population with dyslexia. And then we have, oh, I'm so not good at pulling statistics out of the air, but the statistics around English as a second language. And you start to layer on all of these on top of each other. And all of a sudden, it's not this small percentage that people like to point at. It is everyone, you know, and everyone is different. And that becomes a much easier conversation when someone is trying to push back on, oh, you know, it's too costly to do this, or we don't want to diversify our research and testing to include more diverse users. And for me, this was a fundamental cultural shift. And everything stems from that. All of the, you know, what you do at design, development, test, that kind of thing. We talk about inclusive design. It's just user experience. It's just a mind shift to say that we're including more diverse people. And for me, I know it doesn't sound practical, but that's the first step. You know, you get that, you change culture, and yeah, there's still work to do, but everything flows from that. And so that's sort of my, for me, that's where everything starts. And if you can get that, people get behind it. And suddenly this is no longer a discussion, it's just something you do, something that's part of your definition of done, something that we take pride in. And I think that's a huge shift.
I'm just going to add something else to that. It's when you realise that an edge case is actually not an edge case, and it's a common thing across, you know, for everyone. And just to my sort of development team on, you know, the product that I was working on, I had to stop some of my developers from going to user research sessions because I needed them to actually do the developing. But they were really interested in the diverse, you know, research that we were doing. And he was, you know, some of the developers were just like, why can't we do this all the time? And I was like, well, we are.
It's because you get rich experiences. And I think, you know, for what you were saying, I think there are some things that I think we have to actually come to grips with. Inclusive design takes more time to start with, and it costs a little bit more, but the return is tenfold on the other side. So it's not good enough to go, actually, we're going to have an MVP, but it's not going to include inclusion. It's not going to include accessibility, because what will happen is your product won't. That's when you want to test, that's when you want to iterate. So when we think about how do we do inclusive design, there are 3 key dimensions we use. So the first one is recognising bias. We all have biases, all of us. It's just making them transparent and then making decisions around them. When we talk about co-design, what I say is that disability, like the next time I hear, can we just have a blind person in a group? You know, disability is not a target audience. So look at where the edges are on the work you do, and the techniques we use are actually iterative. So rather than going, let's just get everyone in a room and listen to them and then walk away, we actually get one edge user and then the next, because actually when you do scattergram graphs of users and you go what works, what doesn't work, and what really doesn't work, you actually get the people that everything works for are all together in the middle. And the distance between them is actually quite close. The ones on the edges are not only far away from the edge, they're actually far away from each other. So their experiences are really rich, and people are resilient. So you get these deep, rich hacks that actually help innovate products. So I think that's my second one. And the third one is it's a system. So I was at a meeting today, and Beck Ho from Inclusive Playgrounds was there. And one of the things that they talk about when they talk about making inclusive playgrounds is how are you going to get to the playground? So a system is actually about the environment, not just the product on its own in a lab. So the questions we ask up at the systems level are why are we doing it, until you get to the real why, because sometimes we get so caught up in how that we forget why we were doing it. And then how else can we do it using our senses? So how else can we do it if we can't see, if we can't hear, if we can't touch, if we don't have money for the bus, and if the bus won't get us anywhere, you know? So those sorts of questions I think are really kind of practical. And the last thing in terms of the co-design is actually have diverse design groups as well. So diverse participants, and then diversity in the people who are doing the work, and advocate for that in your own practices. Because the more we have diversity, we know research shows diversity actually breeds creativity and innovation.
Oh, sorry,
Yes. Oh, you've got your mic.
a lot of amazing things, and all I'll add to it is that I absolutely agree with having diverse people on your team. Like it is very cool, but it's also incredibly valuable.
And it means that you don't actually have to go to the user testing sessions to actually hear rich experiences when you've got diversity. So it's actually really lovely. You get rich experiences every day.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. And just on the diverse co-design sort of, or design jams, or whatever we're calling it at the moment, a lot of what you described there was also service design. You know, just thinking about the end-to-end. You know, products make up services, journeys make up a service as well. There's multiple journeys in a service, multiple products, etc. But with co-design, it's so important to have, you know, have different people that do different jobs. I've been fortunate enough to work for a government agency that really values user research and human-centered design, and, you know, putting the human at the heart of everything that we do. And as part of that, we've even got our policymakers doing human-centered design as well, and doing agile policy. So, you know, we're actually contributing to the policy that they're writing, and they're contributing to the product that we're designing and developing.
Next question was, how far do you think we've come? You guys have talked a lot about, you folks have talked a lot about your experiences coming through, but in terms of the maturity of inclusion and diversity in design, how far do you think we've come? And on the back of that is, how far do we still have to go?
When we think of systems, we think of complex adaptive journeys, and I think this is a complex adaptive journey that we're on. One of our board members, Darren Fittler, talks about he's legally blind, and he talks about technology having changed his life from the perspective of wayfinding and all sorts of stuff. But he also talks about the microwave at work. So when we talk about social disability and the idea of the environment impacting on us, 10 years ago he could use the microwave to heat a cup of tea. But today he can't, because 10 years ago there was a dial on his microwave and he could move it, and then he could hear the ping and he knew his cup of tea or coffee was ready. Whereas today, actually with the touch screen, he can't. But with seeing AI, he can actually tell at least if he's drinking decaf or not, right? So I think that it's a really interesting question, and I don't think we've come far away. It's not a right or wrong. But I think we need to think of complexity as part of the system we're in. I didn't really answer that very well, but
Yeah. No, it is a tricky question. I think we have a way to go. As a person with an invisible disability, diversity and inclusion doesn't always extend to me, and I do fall through the cracks occasionally, and I'd like to stop doing that. But yeah, so when I'm booking, when I travel internationally, I have a bit of trouble getting through the airport. I've been calling it travelling while autistic lately, but so I need help getting from where you check in to the actual gate, because when I go through security, I don't always understand the instructions, and it can actually lead to me being mistaken for a security risk. And I have trouble also going through immigration as well, because again, my passport's gotten jammed in things, and I've been confused, and I've wondered what's going on, and they're kind of like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? And I took a bottle of water through security once, and I had no idea why I wasn't allowed to have a bottle of water, because it was just water. And it was weird because the people ahead of me had lighters in their bag, so they thought that I was with them, and I could not understand what was going on. But anyway, when I tell the airline that I need that assistance, there's no way for me to do it at the point of booking. There's usually a list of options, and they're almost always mobility or sensory related. They are never neurological. There's never like a box or an other section for me to just say, hey, look, I need a meet and assist service. That's what it's called. And then when I try to contact the airline, I have to call them. And I have a really hard time communicating over the phone. So a lot of airlines have taken away the ability to email them. So I've actually started tweeting to try and organise my meet and assist services each time I travel. Oh yeah, it works. No, I'm flying with Air New Zealand next week, so I'm really excited about that. But yeah, all sorted over Twitter DM. Yeah, that's just one example, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Mira, for just passing along to me. You can tell Mira and I have known each other for a while. So I do completely acknowledge that we have a long way to go in many, many areas. To coin a phrase I heard I read on the web one day, which was screen readers are the poster child of accessibility. And we definitely need to move past, having a singular person in or, focusing on some of those areas. At the same time, and I've been doing this full time for about 8.5 years, what really, what really heartens me is that 2-3 years ago, particularly in that sort of more disability space, if someone came to me looking to create an accessible site, they'd want it audited against the international standards. So Mira's mentioned WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Today, I get a lot more people talking about and doing, usability testing. And I think that shows that recognition of maturity around how we do see accessibility, in this case more related to disability, but even in the more diversity space, that people are recognising that this is human. We are all human, and when we're designing an experience, we should be leveraging every single technique that we learn as designers and applying that to our work and applying that to a more diverse audience. And I'm really heartened by that, because I've seen time and time again, you can have an experience that ticks the box from a compliance point of view, and yet is completely unusable when a user sits down and goes to use it online, or to look at an experience, or to even ringing a customer support line, and perhaps people haven't thought about how to handle a complaint or a difficulty, and how do you escalate that? So that heartens me, that I think we're gaining in that maturity, and I think this is a process, and it's everyone here that is sitting here and has taken time out, and you're all going back to your organisations and advocating for this, and that's how movement happens. And I think it's incredibly powerful, and I've seen that power over the last 8 years.
So I feel like I've got a slightly different view on that. Also because I'm still a newbie in Australia. So coming from the UK, I would say, without sounding really radical when I say this, but I feel like the maturity levels are slightly different in Australia, between Australia and the UK, and I'm sure other countries too. And so for me, I think it stood out for me immensely when I first came here, just under 4 years ago now. So actually not a complete newbie, I just realized. But it stood out to me because I was coming from where I was working in a accessibility role, heading up the practice over in the UK. I was working there for about 5 years. Some of the clients that we were working for were banks, doing a lot of work for United Nations, doing a lot of work for government, but also commercial stuff as well. So for Walmart and Sainsbury's and some of the telcos and all of that. And the type of problems that we were solving for them as a small pan-disability charity, where I was working in the profitable arm of that, and everything that we did was pumped back into the charity to help people with disabilities. We were having conversations around, the hard stuff, and that was 5 years ago. and beyond that as well. So when I came over here, and we're still having conversations about making things WCAG compliant and doing simple things like color contrast testing and simple things like having a heading on the page and how that could be useful for a screen reader user. And I think earlier it was mentioned that accessibility can be quite difficult. Actually, I disagree with that. I actually think it's not that difficult if you follow web standards and good ways of coding and doing things, in a sort of, a proper way that you should without taking shortcuts. And actually, if you instill that in your day-to-day workflow, it's actually not that difficult. It doesn't feel like a chore. So I found the maturity levels ever so slightly different, but if I compare between 2014 when I first moved here to where we are today, I feel like we have come a long way. And just to echo what Sarah said, I feel like we're having more conversations around users and users being everyone. This is for everyone. And rather than sort of doing testing with people like, you and I, Sarah, where we can use a mobile app. And I think, it's really important to really push those boundaries and keep doing so, because there are organizations, there are a lot of government organizations as well. I mean, I've been working in the government for about 2 years now, and I didn't realize how mature some of the government agencies are, their research teams are, and they're doing research in a really mature way, which is amazing to see. And one of the things I'm seeing more and more of is less of the jumping to solutions first, and more of the whole sort of, building evidence and doing the research to build the confidence in the thing that you're designing and building, rather than jumping to that solution and designing for what the business needs are or whatever, the organization, you're working for, or what the CEO might say or what the minister might say. So it's really nice to be seeing more of that. And I think that comes from people like us, in the room, who are doing the doing and sitting there, working on these things. We need to be pushing that upwards as well, to say to our managers and directors and CEOs that actually we need to spend a little bit more time on this and do this the proper way, because the thing that you then build will be with a lot more conviction and evidence and research, rather than, coming back to this in a few years' time and solving the same problems again.
Which leads to the next question. Sorry, my voice again. What do you feel, from your either professionally or personally perspective, is the biggest challenge we've yet to overcome?
The biggest challenge that I think, I get a lot of emails each week from people who have come up with an idea for something for autistic people, and they this is very good. They just want to know if I like their idea. They don't want to do, they haven't done any research. They don't want to do research. They just want to know, I've come up with this idea for this social app or something that's supposed to help autistic people do blah. Do you like it? What do you think of it? And I tell them what I think. But
well, let me tell you what I really
think. I do. But the biggest thing for me is it's hard to communicate. It's hard to get them to understand that sometimes what they're doing is ableist, and they don't really take that seriously. Like if you design something that's supposed to teach me how to do something or fix me, that's really not okay. That's quite ableist, because I'm not broken. I don't need fixing, but a lot of the design that I see coming through my inbox is aimed at that. So that's the biggest challenge for me, is getting people to say, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with me, but, can you maybe put that other box on that airline checkout thing?
To me. I was going to talk about hiring people, and a lot of the conversation we're talking about at the moment is accessibility centric and inclusion. But let's talk about diversity, and what does diversity actually mean as well. A really good boss of mine once said to me that hire people that are completely different to you, hire people that are smarter than you, and hire people that might create a little bit of tension in the team, because that's where real creativity happens. And you know, I've sort of lived by that for at least sort of 10 years back, you know, sort of a very long time ago, where I had a great mentor who gave me that advice. And that's what I think diversity is about, but we're not doing that, which is really bizarre. So when we look at CVs that have come through, or resumes, we're looking at like-minded people and, you know, sort of mindsets and culture that you can bring into the team that could fit in. But should you really be looking at that? Yes, there is sort of an element of that you should be looking out for. Can they really work in the organization? Will they really fit into the team? But let that be a tiny factor. But try and bring more people that are different to you, and that will bring some of that creativity in your team, or the different sort of ways of thinking. So you can actually embrace diversity, embrace those differences. But what we tend to do is default to the easy thing, which is, you know, I'm going to hire someone who's very similar to me. And then you end up with a team that's very similar to you. And yes, you get along, you have some great social events to go to, and you can go for a drink across the road, or go bowling, or escape rooms. But you can do all of these things, and that's great, but that's not how you're going to transform services or products or really make a difference. And you know, so I'd probably encourage and challenge all of you, if you're in a position where you can hire people, or even input in hiring people, it's not about, you know, diversity from a cultural diversity point of view, or, you know, what country they're for, what language they speak, or disability, not disability. It's about differences and general differences in opinions, and bring some of that. I read a really good article about radical candor and creative abrasion, and I think that's really important. You can Google that and look it up and, you know, find that article. But it talks about having a couple of people in the team that really sort of push those boundaries, where you can have those explosive conversations, which obviously you don't want it to be volatile where it's toxic in your team or in your organization, but you want it to be in a way where it challenges your way of thinking, because that's when you start exploring different ways. And, you know, I think that's where the real magic happens.
Okay, I've got two. The first one is, we did some research, a year ago, 2 years ago maybe even, but it was actually asking the question, look, there's a whole lot of stuff out there to make accessibility easy, and why isn't it happening in Australia, was the question, and what's stopping this from happening? And what came out really was fundamentally fear and shame. And so underneath it all was this idea that, you know, sometimes we want to be politically correct, or we're worried that we're going to offend somebody. It could be the homeless person on the street. We don't want to look at them because we're worried about what will happen when they look at us. It's the unknown. It could be someone who's different to us. When we do that, especially with people with disability, something else happens. We know that's not a very nice way to behave. So shame comes up. And when shame comes up, often people bury their heads in the sand. So what happens is, for the person on the other side, the person who we've walked past or ignored, or who can't see us, so we've just tiptoed around, they're being doubly disabled. Once by the stuff that we're making, but also by our inability to connect with them. So recognising that, I think, goes a long way to realising that actually it doesn't have to be that way. Actually, this is something it's a mind game, really, more than a technical game. So that was the first piece. And the second one is actually realising the value, and I mean in innovation, creativity, dollar value, that actually being inclusive can actually bring. And that's, I think, something that the more we get that out into the world, this becomes not a nice thing to have or an add-on or something we're doing because it's a good thing to do. We're actually doing it because that's just the way the world is. And I think that would be a really great thing too.
I might actually talk about more the technology side of things. So Manisha mentioned, the difference that technology had made to Darren Fittler, and if you ever have a look at TED Talk by Ron McCallum, he talks about, something similar of growing up without technology, and then the freedom and that technology gave him. But sitting on a practitioner side of someone who works in digital accessibility day to day, organisations, particularly organisations producing content management systems or the latest framework, Angular, React, whatever's happening, or even newer technologies, VR, augmented reality, that kind of thing. There is an incredible opportunity if we built in accessibility to these platforms. Then every single time an organisation uses this platform, they get accessibility for free. And that's not to say that there's not a huge element of service design and UX design and that kind of thing. But from a pure technical standpoint, you pick up a component and you use it, and most of the work is done for you. And I can tell you, most of the CMSs, the frameworks, that kind of thing, none of them are doing that. And I'll be perfectly honest, a lot of those commercial products are being sold and people are being told they're accessible, and I work with organisations and come in and I check them and they're not. So those organisations, for me, have an obligation. They need to be building and delivering accessible products, things that you can build an accessible website or digital product with, and things where someone who, say, wants to upload content is accessible. And we also, I think, anyone, particularly if you're working in a large corporate, you also have buying power. You have the power to push back on those companies, to, maybe it's not in your contract now, but when a renewal of contract comes up, to push them and make sure that that's in there and hold them accountable, because they're not accountable at the moment, a lot of them. That would make a huge difference. And it will cut down on that angst, that effort that we often get hit with, oh my gosh, it takes too long, or that kind of thing, because half the work's already done for us.
So we have got a few questions that have come in from Twitter. We did have a question from Air Team, but I felt that the panel's probably covered that with what exactly does diversity and inclusion in design mean, and what does that entail? I think we've talked quite a bit about that already. So I'll move to the next one from Laura Zucchetti. Thank you for that. Should we be demanding specific ALI skills in role descriptions to improve baseline accessibility of digital experiences in teams? And on top of that, what is the state of skills in the market in terms of making accessible experiences by default instead of retrofitting? Actually, that's quite long, so maybe we'll just go for the first part. Thanks, Laura. Which was, sorry, and I'll repeat that, because it was quite a lot. Should we be demanding specific ALI skills in role descriptions to improve baseline accessibility of digital experiences in teams?
Short answer, yes. Long answer. We actually have a fundamental problem. We have a skill shortage, there's no doubt about that, in Australia and also internationally. That's a good thing in the sense of it means the demand is there. It's a bad thing in the sense of finding, particularly highly experienced sort of professionals in this area can be difficult. But we've got this more fundamental issue, which is anyone going through university, TAFE, anything like that around whether it be service design, UX design, computer science, that kind of thing, very rarely do any of their courses include inclusion, diversity, accessibility, whatever it is you want to call it. So we're producing these graduates that don't know even best practice. And the few, say, universities or institutes that are including accessibility, it's usually a single subject. And diversity and what we're talking about is not a single subject. Every single subject that you talk about, when you're doing UX, it should be with diversity in mind. When you're doing computer science, when you're learning to program, it should be you do it this way, not that way, and here is why. So when you go out to market and someone challenges you and says, actually, it'd be quicker to do it this way than that way, you actually can come back and say, no, actually, this has an impact on users. So coming back to, do we need it in our roles and responsibilities? Yes. And that's that circular argument of coming back to, how do we make these institutions actually included in the curriculum so that people have a base level accessibility coming out, and then they can go into organisations and continue building that skill and knowledge.
I also think it's when you're hiring people, so there's two sides to this. So at the DTA, when we hire developers, for example, we ask them the accessibility question. It's one of those. It's not a trick question, but we'll say, hey, what do you know about web accessibility, or just accessibility, like just anything? And in sort of my previous teams, we've hired people that have some knowledge or some passion or enthusiasm to learn and to build accessible websites or web products or whatever. And we've actually sort of tested developers where they're doing one of those development tests, and they've passed that with flying colours, but then we've not hired them as well because they might show great aptitude in sort of general coding experience, but that doesn't mean that they have the aptitude to learn accessibility or care about it enough. And in government land, we are literally designing these services for everyone, and we can't sort of we can't excuse ourselves for stuff like that. Also, the other part of that is, Sarah, you mentioned about the institutions that sort of are delivering us, graduates who don't really have that experience, but we have the opportunities in our teams to push that. So if someone has the desire to learn about web access or accessibility and inclusion in general, why don't we convert those people and make them champions of change as well? Because when they leave your working place, they'll go somewhere else and hopefully, drive that change over there too. So if someone even has a slight desire to learn about it, invest in them and build up, uplift that skill set a little bit more and convert them into someone who really loves doing that work. And when they go out into the wild again, they'll hopefully be taking that with them.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to that just to look for that inclusive mindset so that it's already there. And yeah, it's really all I have.
So we do have a course in accessibility. It's a short course run through the Centre for Inclusive Design and the University of South Australia. And there's also the IAAP, I think, that runs accessibility courses as well. So there are some courses around, but I think, and we're also... Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Is that better? Yes, I was saying we have a short course in accessibility. It's a taster course, but it is there and it is credited, and it's through the University of South Australia. And there's an international one as well, I think. And we're also doing a fair bit of work at the moment with a couple of organisations that look at accreditation. So things like the Internet of Things, looking at STEAM and looking at how we can bake in inclusion with the A in the STEAM, if you like. So there is a little bit of work happening, but I think part of the issue is, and you would know this as well, that the education system is also being disrupted. So we're trying to impact on a formal education system, but then you've got all these courses that are coming out that are not accredited, or that, like General Assembly style courses or different courses that people are taking. So there is flux in the marketplace as well. I think that, like everyone else said, obviously, yes, we want people with accessibility, but if you are on the other side of the table as the candidate, I'd be saying, that's a great question, but how much are you putting your money where your mouth is? How much do you guys believe in accessibility? Show us a product that you've built that you've used accessibility or inclusive principles in. Because often people will ask that of the candidate, but is the culture there in the organisation you're walking into, So I think it's a two-way question, and it's up to great designers to actually make sure that they're walking in with their eyes wide open as well. So I think that might help as well.
We're going to open up to the audience now. So if you have questions, right, Vera, do you want to? You're going to? We have just one over here.
Just got one general question is that, which I find as a user who relies on accessibility, is the default behaviour where a UX designer uses their own personal experience to design the tool. And I got a bit of passion, I'm starting to develop that everyone focuses on the web, but they don't focus on the whole holistic approach of all products. And I'm not just talking about IC products, or I'm talking about products that you use daily, products that you use in shopping centres, etc. So the whole bigger picture. But people work on their perceived interaction. So I would like to get your inputs onto how can we break that model? How can we break that mould?
Hello, Sean. Yeah. Mira's like giving me the microphone. I'm like, oh, do I really want this one first? I definitely take your point. I think that I don't necessarily have, I certainly don't have the silver bullet. I do think it comes back to that level of maturity around how we see accessibility and how it fits into the inclusive design process, so that designers are not designing with their own frame of reference to start with, and recognising that the experience they may have of quickly whipping out a screen reader and running it over a page is not the experience of an everyday user like yourself, Sean. I think that comes back to education. It comes back to that cultural change within an organisation, and maybe also educating designers and developers when they do take out, say, assistive technologies, that if they have the skill, it's understanding, is this working as expected? But that is not what the experience of a user is. And that's two vastly different things. And so looking at that experience of the user and getting real users involved is what is necessary in order to make sure that that experience is going to work for a diversity of users.
I was just going to keep it really simple and say that you are not your user. And, you know, I've sort of made that mistake when I was designing that website 10 years ago and thought, I could see this. So, yeah, just bear that in mind. You know, if you get the opportunity, I do understand that sometimes you don't have the budget to cook all of that in, you know, earlier on and design for that. I've actually stood outside an eye hospital in London waiting for people to come out so I can approach them. You know, it's considerate, not while they were going in, but as they've come out, to have a chat to them and put an app in front of them and turn on VoiceOver on my iPhone and buy them a coffee and have a good conversation, and just to get them to use something and tell me realistically if this is working for them. And, you know, precisely because you are not your user.
But I think that that's absolutely right. Like, the only thing I think I could add was one of the things that we've talked about, and in fact we've talked about with Sarah and Stuart as well, is the need for more research and more numbers and facts and figures around inclusion, in the hope that that actually gives people the tools. So we've got the right brain, you know, the heart and the head as well. So we're doing some research at the moment, funded by Adobe and Microsoft, around the return on investment with inclusive design in Australia. And the three areas we're looking at, and I guess thinking about this, Sean, was we're looking at education, I think I'd remember finance, and retail. And retail came in very much because that's what the community wanted, this notion of online, offline, and that whole experience. And you know, we're not our users, and our products don't work in isolation either. So.
I think it's been covered really nicely. Yeah. More questions?
Going to make Vera walk.
Sorry, Vera. Just when we talk about WCAG, we're talking about very specific rules and we're talking about a very specific structure set down by an organisation. And the research shows that covers around 40% of people's cases. I'm wondering how, if you're not using stats and you're not using traditional business case building techniques, how do you build the rhetoric to convince business to invest in those groups that are not covered by any kind of formal guidelines? Sorry.
Okay, so a couple of things, depending on the company or the organisation that you're in, there is some ROI around inclusion and inclusive design. So I'm not saying throw out WCAG, we actually use WCAG, but I think it's about going, what is your business, how do you normally work, and where's the edge? And also, what are your, who are your target audiences, and what's the extreme of that, who's not able to get to your product? And when we start to say who can't you reach, who aren't you reaching and why, and let's map that, that's when you start to get value. Does that help or not?
Yeah. Just more like if you've got a situation where you potentially, like, Ashley was saying that in an airport, if you don't consider it, you put someone in harm's way, not so much they can get access, like more like if I design something X way, it might harm.
It's like the seatbelt example?
Maybe more like, if she's in the airport and something's not been designed to be inclusive for that, it puts her in harm's way, like potentially getting arrested for looking. I don't know, how would you describe it?
Like a security threat.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we work with companies, some of the work that we do and the workshops and the innovation sessions we run, they're actually quite tough in some ways, but we try to get slice groups of the organisation, slice groups of their audiences and slice groups of, and also people who can't use their products. So they're tough. It's like a mixture of subconscious bias training, cultural awareness training, and UX all in the same place, with the value creation, like where's the money as well. So what you start to get is sometimes if we just use the metrics, as Sarah said, you can't just go 20% of people have disability, so if we do this, 20% more, we'll have 20% more users. But we have to shift heart as well as head together. And so those sorts of sessions work really well. It's like a, we can do inclusive sprints but as well, but the idea is to shift people's mindset at the same time. Because you're right, if we just look at the numbers on their own, there isn't enough data. We have some information, so for the government organisations, there's some work that's been done in Canada where they've mapped government agencies over, one government agency over 5 years, and that organisation looked at justice, e-learning and a few other things, and they mapped the cost benefit. So you could see where the cost benefit was, and it was certainly there from an ROI perspective. But it's really hard because we're talking about nuance. And if, as Sarah, again, sorry, I'm just quoting you now, Sarah. As Sarah said, when we talk about all those stats of all the different types of people, if you tried to put everyone in all the time, it wouldn't work. But if you talk about, say, the Microsofts of the world, etc., they're baking in inclusive design because they want everyone. A lot of government agencies are doing the same thing because they know that if they go to the edges, like the seatbelt, they're going to get a better product for those people in the middle. Same with justice systems, and that's where you get those really nice extreme examples that can sometimes help. But it's tough.
I was just going to say something about, I remember you just reminded me of a conversation I was having with a senior executive in the UK, and he said to me, our users don't have a vision impairment. And I said, okay, well, what does a vision impairment mean to you? And he said, someone who's blind. And I said, well, no, that's not what a vision impairment means. It actually means that someone who might have a mild vision impairment, it could be colour blindness, it could be anything, right? Like just that sort of mild form. And this guy was actually sat in front of me with very thick glasses on. So I asked him to take his glasses off, just simple as that. And I said, okay, I'm just going to give you a short example. Take off your glasses. And he said, oh, but then it was not immediate reaction, but it was this long-winded, but I can't see. And I said, well, there you go. you've got a vision impairment. But it's really, it's the penny drops when you actually see it in action. I'm actually going to give you another example. So working at DTA, we were doing some research with attorney generals, and we had someone from Attorney General in the room, and this was about digital identity. And so this person was really apprehensive about being in the testing session itself, and we were testing with someone with a vision impairment. And all about, so we were talking about digital identity, which documents they would need to verify who they are online to government. And one of the documents we were looking at was a driver license, and we were looking at passport. Someone with a vision impairment may not have a passport, and they will probably not have a driver license, right? So when we were in the room having this conversation, there was no photo ID that this vision impairment user could use, and the penny dropped. And again, it started with that conversation. I think maybe longer actually, almost 3 months later, we were having a conversation with Document Verification Service around, having a photo ID such as a vision impairment card in the system so people can verify their identity online of people that have a vision impairment. He actually then asked for a lot of research that we had done already around it. So it was a conversation starter. It wasn't a big bang, because we can't expect a big bang, right? It was the start of the conversation, and that's how we managed to tell a story around that as well. But it's just that penny dropping, people realizing that one day, today's app designers are going to be old age pensioners of tomorrow, right?
The other one that came to mind, Mira, when you were speaking was, if you think about captioning, we used to think of captioning as something for people who couldn't hear, so you close captions on television, etc. But if you look at it now, how many people go to the gym and watch shows with captions on them, or sit in a bar and have the captions on, or sit at home when you're reading when you're on Facebook videos, or when we're watching movies, in bed, we're all using captioning. So something that was actually made for one small group of the community is now actually being used for a broader group of the community. So sometimes the arguments that sway are not necessarily the volume style ROI arguments, but actually the ones around innovation and insight. So
That just reminded me of something. Those fidget spinner things that people got really excited about? Those are just STEM toys that autistic people have been using for years to sort of just calm our minds down. And then when neurotypicals discovered them, it was like, whoa, now we have more choices. It was great.
Hi, thanks ladies for sharing your thoughts and ideas. So question, what are some resources that we can refer to and rituals that we can engage in our day-to-day to ensure inclusiveness and accessibility other than the WCAG guidelines and Microsoft's inclusive toolkit? Because recently I heard about that CommBank Albert FPOS tablet. So apparently it's 100% compliant, but vision impaired users are actually suing CommBank because it's not usable.
we go back to the 3 principles of inclusive design. So just in terms of what haven't I thought about? What haven't I thought about? Or what are my biases at this point? Who can't use this system? And why? And what else? In terms of the WCAG guidelines, when we work with people, often for those of you who use the WCAG guidelines, the PAW methodology, I use it all the time. I use it when I write emails. I use it when I make posters, because is it perceivable, is it operable, is it understandable, and is it robust? Now, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a website or something completely different. Those things still stand true, it doesn't matter what sort of product it is. So I still use those. And the Albert example, it's an interesting one because actually it's about the system. So that idea of the environment that it's in. So, you know, if you can't hear something, talk to, like, it doesn't work. So it's how do you include that broader system? But really, if nothing else, it's the whys and your senses. So take away your eye, like take away eyes, take away different senses, and see how you can play with that.
Another great resource is people who are marginalised will often write blogs or have podcasts or share their thoughts in some way. Just get your hands on as much of that as you can and just really listen to what they've got to say and listen to a diverse group within the group. So just sort of each person is just one voice, so listen to as many as you can.
Barclays has some great videos. Yep, Barclays Bank. So they've been progressively releasing them, and yeah, they're great introductory videos. There's like one each on the core principles: the perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Gov.uk, their blog, I think is really great. They talk about a whole range of what they're doing in government in the UK. And I think that's, you know, they're sort of sharing what they're doing and how they're doing it and some of the pitfalls and that kind of thing. So I think that's really useful as well. And they're the ones that did the posters as well. Can you remember? Yeah, they've got some posters that you can, yeah, GDS, that's right. Yeah, some posters with sort of quick do's and don'ts for sort of different types of impairments. So you can just like whip them out, print them out, stick them on your wall at work, you know, just to raise awareness. Well, I should probably say, if you, WCAG, we actually released a WCAG map, which was just sort of a structural map of how WCAG looks like. So starting with the core principles, guidelines, and success criteria. So just in a, I don't suggest people start with WCAG. I always do this. Okay, so who has actually read WCAG in the audience? 1, 3, probably not even 10. We're looking at 7. Who enjoys reading WCAG? Yeah, Sean, you don't count. Yeah, you and me too. But obviously, you know, I always talk about WCAG as one tool in your toolkit. You know, it's like, it's not the only tool. There is so many more tools and techniques we can use, but actually I like WCAG. It's great. It has some awesome information. It's just a bit dense. And that probably brings me to the final resource, so the Web Accessibility Initiative website. So for anyone who's probably not visited since May, it used to be old, clunky, and everyone went, wow, did you design this 20 years ago? It's had a complete refresh. They've rewritten a lot of their content. So it's a lot more, funnily enough, user-friendly as a starting point. And they have done a lot of work, so that's the Education and Outreach Working Group, have done a lot of work to sort of, you know, make accessibility more understandable. They've also got 10 short videos on accessibility as well. So again, a great way of just chucking up a video. They talk through, they're only about 2 minutes in length. So I think, yeah, if you haven't been back recently, do go back because, yeah, it's shaping up to be a great resource.
I don't think I have many resources to add to what's already been covered, but you can actually download those posters from DTA website too. So we've got a slight different variation to the GDS UK ones. So things like, you know, yeah, you are not your user, for example. But there's some nice quirky posters there that you can download and put around your office or something. What we also have, and the UK has the same, and so does Canada and you know, the US, is the design system. And I'm not sure if you've come across the design system or if any of you know what a design system is. We've actually built a whole bunch of components, and they're all accessible. They've been tested with screen readers, all assistive technologies, and they're just ready to go. It's available for you to just download immediately from our website. So just go to dta.gov.au and look for design system on there. You can just, you know, pick it up, download the GitHub and go.
Sorry. I have one more. Personas. There's a number of personas online that you can also use. A Web for Everyone, which is actually a great non-technical book around designing for inclusion. They actually have published their 8 personas online. So if you just Google A Web for Everyone personas, you should be able to find it. And gov.uk also has some personas as well that sort of... And what I like about them is that, yeah, we have, our screen reader user, but we also have, multiple impairments in there represented and what have you. So it's a great tool to sometimes break those perceptions that we've been talking about. And the personas are terribly rich. They've got massive amounts of information in there, what the frustrations for those personas are. And gov.uk particularly then has some best practice for designing or developing for those particular impairments that link off to other parts of their site.
That also reminded me, I think it was the Australian AFTRs have actually got some story. They've taken the Australian Film and Television something school have actually got, I think, 75 different storytellers from diverse backgrounds, and they actually have videos and stories that may well be good. Often some of the things on the web don't necessarily have the Australian experience, so it's quite hard to find rich Australian experience, but they've started to look at that as well.
So I think we've got time for one final question, which is just...
It was another resource idea. So a lot of people work in the commercial world, of business in the whole world, where the best and the brightest who can make money for their company, get the jobs. So there's a really good resource called darkpatterns.org. So the concept of a dark pattern is where digital and websites are specifically designed to confuse the customer to get them to spend money. Everybody knows who's gone to book an airline ticket and really had to fight to, get that 7 kilograms off in the car. Now they're charging me 29, and what do I do? I'm sure everyone's had that experience. So, imagine if your grandma or your grandfather's trying to do that. So dark patterns exist in the world, in most commercial web design, and darkpatterns.org is a really good website where it breaks down. Am I making sense? It breaks down how
what not to do.
What not to do, and every day it calls out another company that are doing it. So like big airlines get called out and then they get fined for deliberately deceiving people, and then of course 6 months, 12 months later it comes back, and it's a very good thing. It's just called darkpatterns.org.
Great, thanks. Do we have another one just in the middle here? Sorry, Vera. Keep running. That will have to be our final question for the night.
What about Microsoft accessibility? Yeah.
Thank you. It's a fascinating panel and a great day, great topic, World Interaction Design Day. I actually have a question about bringing multiple worlds together. And so we talked a little bit about the Australian experience being different. I'm conscious that we have a former president of the World Blind Union who is Australian, the current president of the International Disability Alliance, Colin Allen, who is Australian. We've got incredible representation, including Rosemary KS, who's just been elected to the CRPD committee, Ron McCallum having finished his role a few years ago. So Australia is actually really, really well represented in some ways in the international disability and diversity community, but that doesn't always translate to practice. So what I'd really love to hear from you is how can we pull together the worlds of the digital online accessibility, so we talked about WCAG and the online accessibility guidelines, with the universal design and architectural standards to make sure that places can be accessible as well. And then with the products, I know we've got a lot of laws that have been coming out, and Australia's been doing some great work on adopting European and other standards for making places and products more accessible. But that microwave example of how do you make sure that it's not just the website, it's not just the place, but it's also the products. So that day to day, we can make sure that the design is working for everyone.
Yes, the service designer should answer.
That's a really hard question. Probably something over wine as well. Look, it is a tough question, and I think I feel like we've got a sense of responsibility, and whether I'll let sort of someone like Sarah talk about perhaps is there a place where everything can live? Intopia coming up with lots of exciting things there, but I think it's we have responsibility to design the right thing and to call it out. And I think we fit into this, this world where we would just want to conform. And I was having a conversation with someone recently about the lift experiment, or the doctors. I don't know if you've heard about these ones where the lift door is opening one way and everyone's facing the other way, and eventually everyone moves that way. So one person turns, everyone turns, and the entire elevators, people in there have turned the other way around. And it's the same with the doctor's office, where someone's stood up randomly because they have, and then a few more people stand up. I just feel like if we don't start shifting the mindsets, and if we don't start exploring those issues now, who are we waiting for? Like that's the thing that I'm, another really good boss of mine. I've been fortunate enough to work with some amazing people. They said to me, sometimes you've got to be the leader that you need, and that's a really interesting point. It's the same thing with design, that sometimes you've got to be that designer that pushes those boundaries and has those hard conversations and speaks to the right people, and keep doing it and conditioning the people around you and the environment that you're in. I'm not entirely sure how you sort of change over a period of time. I do think that having multiple agents of change across the places is definitely a start. For it now.
Right here. Yes, I don't necessarily know I have the answer either, absolutely. But it makes me think of a few things. First of all, what can we learn from these other areas? I think realistically, when I think of myself, I'm probably not looking at what other areas have done and how we can leverage that and work across these boundaries, as opposed to just seeing it as a building space or a digital experience. And that's why I said Mira as the service designer. Changing how we talk about things from maybe the user experience to the service experience, and broadening that out. I think the other problem we've got is, you mentioned about some standards, and honestly, I think our standards aren't working and there's no one to hold us accountable. From a disability perspective, I feel like our disability discrimination, why have I forgotten? The DDA Act, thank you. I'm having a mental blank, is reactive rather than proactive. So it requires someone to complain as opposed to being proactive. We do have standards, so one of the recent ones, EN 501549, did I get that right, has been adopted by Standards Australia, and yet hardly anyone knows about it and hardly anyone is using it. So it is different, I think, to compare the building space. Someone has to sign off, say, that a building or their building plans comply with some of these standards. The digital space is unregulated. And look, I'm not sure we can regulate the digital space because everyone is a content creator. We do it every day. But at the same time, we do have these standards that have been endorsed, but we're not using them. We're not using them to their full power. We're not even making people aware of them in a lot of cases. So we have a fundamental issue that this, the standards aren't the silver bullet.
Which is why we need to hold ourselves, each other accountable. And that's what I mean with, if you see someone not doing something the right way, prod them that they're not doing things the right way, and that these guidelines do exist, and that might not be the only thing. It's our responsibility to do so.
Yeah, it is a tricky question, but we absolutely do have responsibility for what we put out in the world.
I think there's two sides to this question. One is the inclusion and diversity or accessibility kind of side of things. And I think that, sorry, is that better? I think there's two sides. One is the diversity and inclusion side of things. Like, so how can we make things that are not inclusive, and how does that look when you think about intersectionality, etc.? I actually think, but the other one, which I think is the broader question, is actually we're at an increasingly an incredibly interesting time in the world when the real world and the digital world are colliding at a rapid pace. And in fact, it's not just that the digital world is coming into the real world is becoming digital. It's actually going the other way as well. We're now getting to the point where with AR and VR, where the real world is starting to change. And in that scenario, where I think inclusion sits is it can be the canary in the gold mine. Okay, so when we think about things like what in some worlds might be a hygiene factor. So for instance, we know that people are tired these days because of the overload of technology, but when we're designing, it's probably not something we think about. But when you think about cognitive load for somebody who's using a screen reader, all of a sudden we're thinking about that thing that we all need. So I think that the inclusive design conversation can actually support how we create that new world that's intersecting all these different spaces. But I fully agree with this idea that it's, we were at a conference recently and with the Human Rights Conference, and there were conversations where the big tech companies were asking the American government to regulate them. So this idea of, when have we heard that before? And it's because they're seeing the way their products are being used, or the potential for good and bad. And so I think this idea, Australia is way behind when it comes to regulation, and we need more of it, but we need good regulation, But,
around 2000,
yeah.
IxDA came out. IBM had won a lot of awards for having wonderful websites. It was raked over the coals and pled guilty to not having an accessible website, or it should have. And at the time, everyone thought big stick was the way to go. It's not. We should be complimenting people having inclusive, diverse websites that are very, very successful, that are giving great returns to the companies that are building those websites. That's what will work. Nobody wants to go out and try and sue someone for not having
No. And look, I see that point as well, but we're in a really interesting conversation about ramps, and one of the conversations was, yes, it's great to have, I think we need the carrot and the stick, and I don't think that we need, if we've got the stick, it has to be a good stick, not a stupid stick, but, and often government regulation can go either way. But we were talking to one of the leading advocates from Vision Australia, actually, and the point he made was we were arguing and talking about ramps all the time until they were mandatory, and then the conversation disappeared. I didn't have to argue. I didn't have to talk about why it was good. I didn't have to pat people on the back for something that actually should just have been there. And I guess that's why I think the carrot and the stick are important. And when I say that that we don't have a lot of regulation, I'm talking about things like audio description, where we're the only country in the English-speaking world that doesn't have regulation around audio description, and I think this is really important for us as well.
Thank you for, sorry, Ashlea, did you have anything? Apologies. Okay. Thank you everyone for your time tonight, and if we could just thank Adobe for supplying us with the funding to put tonight on. The wonderful IxDA volunteers who got you all in here fed and beveraged.
BCG DV for hosting us with this great space. And finally, to the panel, thank you all so much for coming out and sharing your experiences, both personally and professionally tonight. I think we all got so much out of this, and it's been an amazing experience for everyone here.
Can we just thank Lisa for being such a great moderator, and the IXDA team, and as well as the audience for all of you staying back and listening to us for all this time. It's been awesome. Thank you.